10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Myths and symbols of a prehistoric mother goddess have long enchanted investigators of the early cultures. One reason for the fascination is the connection of the goddess to the earliest forms of artistic expression. In their creation of revered goddess figurines, what were these prehistoric artists depicting, and why? Examples are abundant, but where are the plausible explanations? From the vantage point developed in this video series, might we discern something concretely experienced, but unknown today? Amongst all of the prehistoric goddess images, the most attention has gone to the so-called Venus of Willendorf, categorized as Venus de Autophagia, the obese Venus. Along with thousands of counterparts, this unusual theme poses a profound question as to Earth's prehistoric environment. Beginning in the 1960s with the first stirrings of a so-called goddess movement, researchers began to selectively interpret the prehistoric theme, seeing it in the context of envisioned matriarchal cultures. But then, almost as quickly, that interpretation receded into the background. In the mid-1970s, we proposed that a close congregation of planets, Earth included, moved through a cloud of dust and gas, obscuring the background stars while highlighting the unique appearance of the gathered bodies as a living form. We suggested that this occurred long before any such body was named as a planet and prior to the quasi-stable polar configuration we've discussed at length in this series. What was seen in that prehistoric epoch was not static, but produced a complex of spiraling aspects, toruses, and other features, often including a tapering extension of gas and dust descending toward the horizon of observers on Earth. This earlier, more primitive goddess form presents a radical contrast to everything we've learned about the later evolution of the polar configuration. In this phase, we see little or nothing to suggest direct solar illumination of the planetary participants. In fact, no indication of any cosmic cycle whatsoever, and certainly nothing comparable to the revolving crescent in the polar configuration, few if any radial discharge phenomena either. In seeking to comprehend the prehistoric goddess, we begin with one inescapable assumption, that widespread patterns must have an explanation in human experience, even if that explanation has yet to be recognized. Of course, it would be futile to search for reference in the sky today. The sky has changed. But the ancient motives can be revealed by simply following the evidence for an unusual condition. For example, what does the unnaturally rotund goddess aspect signify? Why are arms and feet so frequently missing? Or why the often conical or tapering lower limbs? Or the occasionally tapering upper aspect? Or why the unnaturally spherical, often featureless heads, or other spherical aspects of the goddess? As to the uncertainty of theoretical interpretations, we offer a tip of the hat to Wikipedia. The original cultural meaning and purpose of these artifacts is not known, Wikipedia states. That is indeed the truth of the matter. Anthropologists and archaeologists cannot explain the motive or the cultural context for the prehistoric goddess images. But one recurrent pattern in particular gives us a window into the prehistoric condition. Certain unique features of the archaic goddess remind us of the toroidal forms we previously observed in the evolution of the polar configuration. In the prehistoric setting, this aspect shows up almost endlessly, often appearing as a pair of unnaturally spherical eyes, somewhat similar to the eye mask we've highlighted in earlier discussions. But we also see these unnatural eyes accompanied by other toroidal forms, seemingly with no natural place or function. In the prehistoric period, this toroidal aspect stands out most prominently in its connection to folded arms enclosing the breasts of the goddess, sometimes from above and sometimes from below. This variable form deserves a closer look. By all appearances, the observer standing on Earth experienced something close to an edge-on view into a toroidal configuration. But it seems that librations in that position highlighted an alternating appearance of the goddess's arms above or below the toroidal boundary. In both cases, it's the repeated connections of the goddess's arms to the toroidal enclosure that give us the enigmatic but most familiar pose of the goddess. Ambiguities in our first impressions will generally disappear under closer investigation. In the most common view of the goddess figurine, an observer may not immediately realize that the goddess's arms fold over her breasts, and yet that position becomes undeniable when seen from a side view of the goddess. More frequently, we see the arms of the goddess in the lower position. The conclusion standing out above all other details is the implied toroidal form of the goddess's arms, marking out and highlighting the enclosed space. Once discerned, that general pattern becomes predictable across a large number of prehistoric goddess forms, and in many cases it will be impossible to miss. Our proposed answer to the mystery of the prehistoric goddess requires nothing more than a medium of gas and dust and charged particles through which planets formerly moved. Planets immersed in this dusty plasma cloud, engaged in continuous electrical transactions, the one requirement to produce all the formations anciently observed, including the entire variety we've already documented in this series. But can the connection between the Paleolithic goddess and planets be named more precisely? Clearly, the modern scholars who first named the ancient goddess images as Venus figurines had no idea as to how appropriate that language might become as these artifacts began to draw more scholarly attention. And of course, the Paleolithic goddess images arose long before the polar configuration we've described, and that means long before the astronomical identification of the goddess with a particular planet, Venus. And yet this undisputed fact still leaves the question as to why, with the rise of planetary astronomy in ancient times, the newly trained observers of the sky consistently identified the mother goddess with just one planet, Venus, and no other. So we cannot afford to overlook the question of cause and effect. Throughout this series of discourses, we've suggested that none of the mythic archetypes, not a single one, could have arisen under the present sky. The sky changed. But now, just as clearly, we can see that the earliest prehistoric forms of a mother goddess also point back to an unfamiliar sky in Paleolithic times. This evidence deserves to be followed with the same attention to detail that we've applied to the later polar configuration. Is it possible to reconstruct an ancient experience before the emergence of the polar configuration? What changes in Earth's celestial environment must have occurred after the dominance of this archaic goddess form to inspire the great civilizations, or the consequent explosion of writing, storytelling, the emergence of kings and kingship rights, all with little or no precedent in the earlier epoch? On their own, the prehistoric goddess images do not sufficiently clarify the cultural context, and many details seem to appear out of nowhere. And yet the recurring similarities are suggestive of something much more profound than mere absurdity or outlandish caricature of female forms. These curiosities are an open invitation to systematic comparative investigation, as we shall further document in our next episode. This video will continue our exploration of the ancient Mother Goddess, whose first appearance we have traced back to prehistoric times. It seems that with the emergence of the more advanced civilizations, including the monumental cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the primeval goddess faded into the background and often disappeared altogether. In the prehistoric epoch, there are no written histories to guide us, but there are abundant figurines suggesting a mysterious feminine form with certain unique features. In this earliest phase, we cannot say whether regional wars were commonplace or largely absent. Hunting weapons seem more obvious than preparations for battle. We see little or no evidence of the warrior kings that appeared so forcefully with the emergence of the great civilizations that followed. Unsettled issues include the origins and meaning of sacrifice and details concerning death and burial. Nevertheless, based on the totality of evidence explored in this series, a variety of conclusions can be drawn as to the prehistoric environment from which the first images of a mother goddess emerged. For context, our approach to the mother goddess draws upon a larger investigation into the wide-ranging cross-cultural archetypes of the antique world. These most fundamental structures of ancient thought, at the dawn of civilization, invite us to work backward in time to envision a world before historical chronicles and before systematic timekeeping. That means prior to the first appearance of what we've called the polar configuration, a grand assembly of planets gathered close to Earth and moving through a dusty plasma cloud. Our claim has been that it was this polar configuration, by its impact on human imagination, that catalyzed the emergence of symbols and sacred practices that defined early civilizations. And so, one puzzle drawing our attention is the dramatic break that appears to separate the prehistoric phase from the subsequent emergence of developed languages and commemorative practices. It seems that this gap largely excludes the evidential linkage or chain of events that one might have hoped to follow across the divide from prehistoric to historical evidence, and yet several tantalizing clues invite us to ask new questions. Across the prehistoric period, we observe two evolutionary phases in the emergence of a mother goddess image. Both are explicable, but only within the framework of a radical challenge to common thinking. The earliest evidence includes a first female form that historians and archaeologists still struggle to understand, a distinctly rotund goddess type called Steatopygia. As we should expect, there is a frequent and inexplicable suggestion of sphericity in the prominent features of the primitive goddess. And we're not surprised that the spherical head or face of the goddess often appears featureless, or that the lower limbs are frequently presented as a tapering column, exactly as we've seen in our review of the Martian contribution to the polar configuration. For us, this places an exclamation point to an inescapable conclusion throughout these investigations, that something unrelated to any human cause provoked the extraordinary depictions of the mythic gods. In the emergence of the prehistoric goddess idea, there was a second phase as well. That phase involved a distinctive torus or enclosure, displaying a visual opening and closing as the celestial bodies moved through space. This effect can be compared to the variable positions we previously observed in the symbolic arms wrapped around the margins of the enclosure and appearing in competing positions above and below the breasts of the goddess. In fact, the changing visual plane of the torus adds additional clarity to that ancient concept. And for us, that means a new chapter in this investigation, a chapter we could not have written just a year ago. A critical breakthrough comes from an anciently depicted, clearly toroidal womb of goddess figures where no human attribute will explain the unique form presented. The ring displayed by this Olmec goddess is a useful starting point, and it is not unique. Even more striking is the Moshe counterpart many centuries earlier, in which the torus is sufficiently clear to identify that form as the archetype, whereby the associated female figure simply gives the context of the mythic interpretation. Ironically, it's another example from the opposite side of the world that offers the most striking counterpart to the South American goddess images. In this case, not only supporting a radically new interpretation of the goddess, but confirming the direct connection to the visual opening and closing of the envisioned torus. We refer here to the enigmatic images of the mythic figure named Sheela-na-gig. Her widely distributed images, appropriately called grotesques, are found across much of Europe, most prominently in Ireland, and enigmatically most often placed close to the entrances to churches. The general consensus is that they had a protective function, similar to that of the Medusa head placed above temple entrances in other parts of the world. But beyond that agreement, scholars are still looking for an explanation of the deeply entrenched idea. In the case of Sheela-na-gig, the connection to the visual opening and closing of a torus is simply too strong to be disputed, as we see most emphatically in these examples from Ireland, and most notably in the instance shown here, where the toroidal form stands out as nothing else than a torus seen from a position orthogonal to the plane of the torus itself, and thus in the fully open position visually. What then was the relationship of the opening and closing of the Sheela-na-gig torus to the eye mask form also displayed by this very figure? That's a form with which we are already familiar, and the answer comes from the ancient habit of juxtaposing alternative mythic interpretations of underlying archetypal forms. In this instance, the question has already been answered by our earlier analysis of the polar configuration, where the twin eyes of the eye mask image are explained by the unique forms of electric discharge in the plasma laboratory, as we learned from the leading plasma scientist Anthony Peratt over a dozen years ago. Seen from the edge-on vantage point, the observer looked directly into the twin aspects on opposite sides of the tubular torus itself. As viewers who followed our presentations will remember, in the famous stickman image so frequently seen carved on stone globally, twin dots on opposite sides of the figure resulted from a field of view directly into the tubular plasma discharge form. But now there is more to consider, since the visual opening and closing of the torus would affect both the symbolism of the twin eyes and the toroidal void so frequently and enigmatically enclosed by the twin arms of the ancient goddess. Both the twin eyes and the toroidal folded arms direct our attention back to distinctive aspects of the root forms. Eyes closed, or eyes fully open with a direct view into the tubular torus that constituted the visual boundary of the enclosure, to which we add the tapering lower limbs of the goddess as the formation evolved. Our claim is that the full complex of symbolic patterns belongs to a unified substructure tracing back to prehistoric times. And lastly, it's not just in the ancient images and not just in laboratory experiments that we observe the twin aspects of the plasma torus. Today we see similar geometry in the toroidal form configured around the south pole of the planet Venus, though obviously diminished and degraded as planets moved around the sun in increasing isolation. The original dynamics of the primitive goddess archetype can still be discerned, and that's a synchronicity well worth investigating, one polar vortex producing twin vortices, just as our study of the eye mask revealed, and just as laboratory experiments have so conclusively demonstrated. and now just as we have observed in the prehistoric Mother Goddess. Such considerations as these can only add crucial support for an extraordinary human experience, confirming once again that the ancient world was indeed a very different place.